Behind the gilded gates of Ravensholm Palace, where tradition and protocol rule with iron fists, a single moment of discovery would shatter the fragile peace that had taken years to build. Lady Catherine had always believed that respect was earned through patience and grace, but when she walked into the late Queen Isabella's private chambers that gray October morning, she would learn that some betrayals cut deeper than any royal decree could heal. The autumn mist clung to the ancient stones of Ravensholm Palace like whispered secrets, and Lady Catherine Ashworth felt the familiar weight of duty pressing against her shoulders as she made her way through the East Wing corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, a sound she had grown accustomed to over the past 3 years since marrying Prince Alexander and becoming part of the royal household. Catherine paused outside the ornate doors leading to the late Queen Isabella's private chambers, her hand hovering over the brass handle. These rooms had been sealed since the Queen's passing 18 months ago, preserved exactly as she had left them on that final morning. The decision to maintain the chambers untouched had been unanimous among the family, a gesture of respect for the woman who had ruled with such grace and dignity for over 4 decades. Today marked the anniversary of Queen Isabella's death, and Catherine had volunteered to personally ensure fresh flowers were placed throughout the rooms before the private memorial service that evening. It was a small act of devotion, one she hoped would demonstrate her genuine respect for the woman who had welcomed her into the family with open arms, despite the initial reservations of certain family members. As she turned the handle and stepped inside, Catherine was immediately struck by the preserved atmosphere of the chamber. Dust motes danced in the pale morning light filtering through the heavy curtains, and the air carried the faint scent of the Queen's favorite lavender perfume, as if her presence still lingered within these walls. The sitting room remained exactly as Queen Isabella had left it. Her reading glasses rested on the mahogany side table next to an unfinished letter, the fountain pen lying beside it as though she had simply stepped away for a moment. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece, capturing decades of royal history in silver frames that gleamed despite the gathering dust. Catherine moved through the rooms with reverent care, noting each familiar detail. The Queen's favorite armchair still bore the slight indentation where she had spent countless hours reading state papers and correspondence. Her collection of first-edition novels remained perfectly organized on the built-in shelves, each spine aligned with military precision that reflected Isabella's attention to detail. It was when Catherine reached the bedroom that her careful composure faltered. The sight that greeted her sent a chill racing down her spine, followed immediately by a surge of disbelief and then burning indignation. The bed, which should have been adorned with Queen Isabella's signature ivory silk linens embroidered with the royal crest, was instead dressed in deep burgundy satin sheets that Catherine had never seen before. The elegant cream-colored coverlet that the Queen had treasured, a wedding gift from her own mother, lay crumpled on the floor beside the bed as though carelessly discarded. But it was not just the changed bedding that caused Catherine's breath to catch in her throat. Personal items that clearly did not belong to the late Queen were scattered across the room with shocking familiarity. A modern jewelry box sat prominently on Isabella's antique vanity, its contents spilling onto the surface in a careless display that would have horrified the meticulously organized Queen. Several books with contemporary covers were stacked on the nightstand, their bright dust jackets a jarring contrast to the room's subdued elegance. Catherine's trained eye immediately recognized these belongings. She had seen that particular jewelry box countless times during family gatherings, had noticed those same book titles being discussed over afternoon tea. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her momentarily breathless. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Alexander's stepmother and the current queen consort, had been using Isabella's private chambers as her own personal retreat. The betrayal felt visceral and immediate. Queen Isabella's rooms were not simply another set of chambers within the palace. They represented a sacred space that held the memories and essence of a beloved monarch. The family's collective decision to preserve these rooms had been more than mere sentiment. It was a promise, a covenant of respect that bound them all. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she moved deeper into the room, documenting the extent of the intrusion. Expensive perfumes that belonged to Margaret lined the vanity table, their modern bottles looking alien among Isabella's classic crystal atomizers. A silk robe that Catherine recognized as one of Margaret's favorites hung carelessly over the back of Queen Isabella's private chair, the same chair where the late Queen had spent her final morning reading letters from her grandchildren. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. This was not a case of mistaken usage or a misunderstanding among the palace staff. The personal nature of the items, the casual way they had been arranged throughout the space, suggested that Margaret had been using these chambers regularly and without permission. Catherine found herself thinking of Prince William, Alexander's elder brother and the heir apparent. William had been particularly close to his mother, and the loss had affected him deeply. During the family discussions about preserving Queen Isabella's rooms, William had spoken eloquently about the importance of maintaining these spaces as a tribute to their mother's memory. He had personally overseen the initial preservation efforts, ensuring that every detail remained untouched. The thought of William discovering this violation made Catherine's heart race, with a mixture of protective instinct and righteous anger. She could imagine the pain it would cause him to learn that his mother's sanctuary had been compromised in such a callous manner. As she stood in the violated sanctuary, Catherine grappled with the immediate decision facing her. Protocol dictated that such matters should be handled through proper channels, perhaps brought to the attention of the palace administration or discussed privately with Alexander first. But the deeply personal nature of this betrayal seemed to transcend normal protocol. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted her contemplation. Catherine quickly moved to the window, her mind racing as she considered her options. She could confront Margaret directly, but that approach risked escalating the situation without achieving any meaningful resolution. She could inform Alexander, but his relationship with his stepmother was already complicated by years of careful diplomacy following his father's remarriage. The footsteps paused outside the chamber doors, and Catherine heard the soft murmur of voices. Her heart pounded as she realized that someone was about to enter the room. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. She, who had come here with pure intentions to honor the Queen's memory, would now be discovered in chambers that had been secretly violated by another family member. The door handle turned slowly, and Catherine found herself face to face with Mrs. Pemberton, the head of housekeeping, who appeared startled to find anyone in the sealed chambers. "Your ladyship, Mrs. the Firman?" Pemberton said with evident confusion. "I wasn't expecting anyone to be in these rooms today." Catherine studied the older woman's expression carefully, noting the slight nervousness that seemed to cloud her usual professional composure. As head of housekeeping, Mrs. Pemberton would have been responsible for maintaining these chambers, which meant she would have been aware of any unauthorized usage. "Mrs. Pemberton?" Catherine said carefully. "I came to arrange fresh flowers for tonight's memorial service, but I'm afraid I've discovered something quite disturbing." The housekeeper's face grew pale, and Catherine realized immediately that her suspicions were correct. Mrs. Janae Pemberton had known about Margaret's unauthorized use of the chambers, and her uncomfortable silence confirmed her complicity in the deception. "I think," Catherine said with quiet determination, "that it's time Prince William was informed about what has been happening in his mother's private rooms." The weight of the decision settled around Catherine like a mantle of responsibility. She understood that her next actions would have consequences that rippled far beyond this single morning, potentially affecting relationships and alliances within the royal family for years to come. But as she looked around the desecrated chamber, she also understood that some principles were worth defending, regardless of the personal cost. The late Queen Isabella had trusted her family to preserve her memory with dignity and respect. That trust had been violated, and Catherine found herself in the unexpected position of being its defender. The path forward would not be easy, but her conscience left her no choice but to pursue justice for the woman who could no longer advocate for herself. The Catherine had been dreading arrived sooner than expected, as Mrs. Fortune. Pemberton hurried away to summon Prince William. The sound of confident footsteps echoed through the corridor, accompanied by a voice Catherine recognized with sinking dread. "Pemberton, have the arrangements been made for this evening's service? I specifically requested that my favorite flowers be used in the main arrangements." Queen Margaret's authoritative tone carried clearly through the open doorway. Catherine felt her pulse quicken as she realized Margaret was approaching the very chambers she had been secretly using. The timing could not have been more revealing or more damaging to Margaret's position. When Margaret appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a tailored navy dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. Her expression shifted rapidly from surprise to calculation to barely concealed irritation. "Catherine, darling," Margaret said with forced warmth, "whatever are you doing in these old rooms? Surely the staff should be handling any preparations needed for tonight." The casual dismissal in Margaret's tone, referring to Queen Isabella's private sanctuary as merely "these old rooms," ignited something fierce within Catherine. She had always prided herself on maintaining diplomatic composure, but standing amid the evidence of such blatant disrespect, she found her patience exhausted. "I came to place fresh flowers in honor of Queen Isabella's memory," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the tension coursing through her body. "What I found instead was rather shocking." Margaret's eyes swept the room quickly, taking in the burgundy sheets, the scattered personal belongings, and Catherine's obviously upset demeanor. For a brief moment, her carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing something calculating and cold beneath the practiced royal composure. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Margaret said, stepping into the room with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling situations through sheer force of personality. "These chambers require regular maintenance, and occasionally adjustments must be made to preserve the furnishings properly." The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Catherine gestured toward the jewelry box, the modern books, and the expensive perfumes that clearly belonged to Margaret. "Regular maintenance doesn't typically involve moving in personal belongings," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger with conviction. Queen Isabella's rooms were meant to remain untouched as a memorial. The entire family agreed to this, including you. Margaret's composure cracked slightly, revealing the sharp intelligence that had helped her navigate her way from minor nobility to the throne. She moved closer to Catherine, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone that carried an unmistakable undercurrent of threat. "My dear Catherine, you're still quite new to this family and perhaps don't fully understand how these matters work. Sometimes decisions that seem final must be reconsidered for practical reasons. Isabella's rooms are some of the finest in the palace, with the most beautiful views and the most comfortable arrangements. It would be wasteful to leave such spaces unused indefinitely." "Wasteful?" Catherine's voice rose despite her efforts to maintain control. "We're talking about preserving the memory of your husband's first wife, a woman who ruled this country with grace and dignity for over 40 years. These aren't just rooms. They're a sacred trust." Margaret's facade of maternal concern dropped entirely, replaced by the steely determination that had characterized her rise to power. "Sacred trust is a rather melodramatic way to describe room allocation," Margaret said coldly. "Isabella is gone, Catherine. She has no further need for worldly comforts. The living, however, do have needs, and as the current queen, I have both the authority and the responsibility to make decisions about how palace resources are utilized." The callousness of Margaret's words hit Catherine like a slap. She thought of Prince William's grief, of Alexander's careful efforts to honor his mother's memory, of King James's own struggle with loss and remarriage. The family had collectively agreed to preserve these chambers because they represented more than mere sentiment. They were a tangible connection to a beloved woman whose influence had shaped them all. "You had no right," Catherine said, her voice shaking with barely contained fury. "This decision wasn't yours alone to make, the entire family." "The family," Margaret interrupted sharply, "follows the lead of the current monarch and his queen. James has been informed of my decision to repurpose these chambers, and while he may have initial reservations, he understands the practical necessities involved." Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. If Margaret was telling the truth about King James's knowledge and consent, then the situation became infinitely more complex. But something in Margaret's tone, a slight defensiveness beneath the authority, suggested that perhaps the king's approval had been secured through less than complete honesty about Margaret's intentions. "Does the king know that you've been using his first wife's private chambers as your personal retreat?" Catherine asked directly. "Does he know about the jewelry, the books, the personal items you've moved in here?" Margaret's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm Catherine's suspicions. The Queen had likely presented the repurposing as a practical administrative decision, perhaps framing it as converting unused space for official purposes rather than revealing her intention to use Isabella's most private spaces for her own comfort. "My conversation with the King about palace administration is not your concern," Margaret said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "What is your concern, however, is understanding your place within this family and learning when discretion is more valuable than misguided moral outrage." The threat was unmistakable, and Catherine felt a chill of real fear. Margaret possessed considerable power within the royal household, and her displeasure could make Catherine's life significantly more difficult. But as she looked around the violated chamber, Catherine found her resolve strengthening rather than weakening. "My place in this family," Catherine said quietly, "is to support and protect those I love." Queen Isabella welcomed me with kindness and grace when others were skeptical. I won't stand by while her memory is dishonored. Margaret's eyes flashed with genuine anger, and for the first time in their confrontation, Catherine glimpsed the ruthless ambition that had driven the woman's rise to power. "You foolish girl," Margaret hissed. "Do you think your romantic ideals about honor and memory matter more than the realities of royal life? Isabella is dead and buried. What matters now is ensuring the stability and prosperity of the living monarchy. What matters now," a new voice said from the doorway, "is understanding why my mother's private chambers have been turned into someone else's personal suite." Both women turned to see Prince William standing in the entrance, his face pale but his eyes burning with an intensity that made the air in the room feel charged with electricity. Behind him stood Alexander, his expression torn between loyalty to his wife and shock at the scene before him. Catherine felt a moment of profound relief. Whatever consequences followed, she was no longer facing this confrontation alone. William stepped into the room slowly, his gaze taking in every detail of the violation with methodical precision. When he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a future king. But underneath lay the raw pain of a son whose mother's memory had been callously betrayed. "Stepmother," he said, the formal title carrying a weight of accusation. "I believe you have some explaining to do." Margaret straightened, clearly preparing to deploy the same arguments she had used with Catherine, but William's next words stopped her cold. "And before you begin," he continued, his voice deadly quiet, "you should know that Mrs. Pemberton has already provided a full account of how long you've been using these chambers and how much effort has gone into concealing that fact from the rest of the family." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine watched Margaret's face cycle through surprise, calculation, and finally defiance as she realized that her secret had been exposed completely. Alexander stepped forward, his own face reflecting the shock and disappointment that seemed to be settling over him like a heavy cloak. "Mother Margaret," he said, using the more intimate title that reflected their closer relationship, "tell me this isn't what it appears to be. Tell me there's some explanation that makes sense of all this." Margaret looked between the three younger members of the royal family, and Catherine could see her making rapid calculations about how to minimize the damage to her position and reputation. "Very well," Margaret said finally, lifting her chin with aristocratic pride. "Yes, I have been using these chambers occasionally, but not out of disrespect for Isabella's memory. Quite the opposite. I felt that allowing such beautiful rooms to remain empty and unused was the greater disrespect. I thought that by maintaining them, by ensuring they remained vital and lived in, I was honoring her legacy." The explanation was clever, casting her violation as a form of tribute rather than betrayal. But William's expression suggested he was not prepared to accept such a revisionist interpretation of events. William's response came with the measured authority of someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments of difficult decision-making. The future king stepped further into the chamber, his movements deliberate and controlled, but Catherine could see the emotional storm beneath his composed exterior. "Honoring her legacy," William repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "By sleeping in her bed? By replacing her carefully chosen belongings with your own? By conducting what appears to be a months-long deception involving multiple staff members?" Margaret's composure wavered under the intensity of William's questioning. She had clearly not anticipated being confronted so directly or having her carefully constructed justifications dismantled with such precision. "William, you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment," Margaret said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "These rooms have been sitting empty for over a year, gathering dust and serving no purpose. Your mother would have wanted them to be useful, to serve the family." "My mother," William interrupted, his voice rising for the first time, "specifically requested that her private chambers remain unchanged for at least 5 years after her death. She made this request directly to my father in writing as part of her final wishes. Did you think we had forgotten? Did you assume that document would conveniently disappear?" Catherine felt her breath catch. She had not known about Queen Isabella's written wishes, but the revelation explained the vehemence of the family's commitment to preserving the chambers. Margaret's violation wasn't just a betrayal of informal family agreement, it was a direct contradiction of the late Queen's explicit desires. Margaret's face had gone noticeably pale, and Catherine realized that the Queen consort might not have been aware of Isabella's written instructions. The possibility that Margaret had acted without full knowledge of the deceased Queen's wishes added another layer of complexity to an already explosive situation. Alexander stepped forward, his role as mediator between his brother and stepmother suddenly made much more difficult by this revelation. "Father never mentioned Mother's written wishes to Margaret," Alexander said carefully. "Perhaps if we all step back and consider that this might have been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. William turned to his younger brother with an expression of incredulous anger. "Alexander, look around this room. Look at the systematic replacement of our mother's belongings with Margaret's personal items. Look at the careful concealment from family members. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a calculated appropriation of sacred space." Catherine found herself caught between admiration for William's principled stand and concern for the fractures that were clearly developing within the family structure. The royal household depended on careful balance and mutual respect, and this confrontation threatened to destroy relationships that had taken years to build. Margaret seemed to sense the shift in dynamics and attempted a different approach, appealing directly to family unity. "This arguing serves no one," she said with forced calm. "What's done is done. I made a decision that I believed was practical and reasonable. If I was mistaken about Isabella's specific wishes, then I apologize for that oversight. But destroying family harmony over room arrangements seems disproportionate to the actual harm done." "Room arrangements?" William's voice carried genuine astonishment. "You're still characterizing this as mere room arrangements? You moved into our dead mother's bed, Margaret. You replaced her personal items with yours. You turned her sanctuary into your secret retreat. And you did it all while watching us struggle with our grief and our efforts to honor her memory properly." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Catherine realized that they had moved far beyond questions of protocol or palace administration. This confrontation had become about fundamental values, about respect for the dead, about honesty within family relationships, and about the proper use of power and privilege. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with her role in the unfolding drama, but apparently summoned by one of the royal family members. "Your Highnesses," she said with obvious nervousness, "His Majesty has requested that all family members meet him in the blue drawing room immediately." The summons from King James changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Whatever resolution might have been reached privately among the younger generation would now be subject to the judgment of the monarch himself. Margaret immediately straightened, her confidence returning as she prepared to present her case to her husband. Catherine noticed the subtle change in the Queen's demeanor. The defensive uncertainty was replaced by the assured bearing of someone who expected royal support. "Perhaps," Margaret said with renewed authority, "this matter can finally be resolved by someone with proper perspective and decision-making authority." William's expression darkened at the implication that he lacked proper authority or perspective, but he simply nodded curtly and gestured for the group to proceed to the requested meeting. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the blue drawing room, Catherine found herself reflecting on the gravity of the situation. Royal family disputes rarely remained private, and the potential for this confrontation to become public knowledge added another dimension of concern. The monarchy depended on public respect and confidence, and revelations about internal conflicts over something as sensitive as Queen Isabella's memory could prove damaging to the institution itself. Alexander moved closer to Catherine as they walked, his expression troubled. "I had no idea," he murmured quietly. "Margaret never mentioned using Mother's rooms, and I never thought to check. I should have been more attentive." Catherine squeezed his hand reassuringly. "You couldn't have known if deliberate steps were taken to conceal it. The responsibility for this deception lies with those who created it, not with those who trusted family members to act honorably." Ahead of them, Margaret walked with determined confidence, while William maintained the rigid bearing of someone preparing for a difficult but necessary confrontation with his father. The blue drawing room was one of the more formal spaces within the palace, typically used for important family meetings and sensitive discussions. King James was already present when they arrived, standing near the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens. At 68, he remained an imposing figure, though the losses and challenges of recent years had aged him noticeably. The king's expression was unreadable as his family members arranged themselves around the room. Margaret moved to stand near her husband, while William positioned himself across from them in a stance that suggested he was prepared for battle. Alexander and Catherine remained slightly apart, their position reflecting their complex loyalties in the developing conflict. "I understand," King James began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of royal responsibility, "that there has been some disagreement regarding the use of palace chambers." The understated phrasing suggested that the king might not have been given complete information about the nature of the conflict. Catherine glanced at William, noting the tightness around his eyes as he prepared to provide his father with a more comprehensive understanding of the situation. "Father," William began carefully, "we've discovered that Queen Isabella's private chambers, the rooms you agreed should remain untouched in accordance with her written wishes, have been systematically used by Margaret as her personal retreat for several months." King James's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Catherine caught the flash of something: surprise, pain, or perhaps anger, that crossed his features before being carefully controlled. Margaret stepped forward immediately. "James, darling, I've already explained to the children that my use of those chambers was intended to maintain them properly and prevent them from falling into disrepair. I never meant any disrespect to Isabella's memory." "The children?" William's voice carried a dangerous edge at Margaret's casual dismissal of his concerns. King James raised a hand for silence, and the room fell quiet as he considered his response. Catherine realized that the king's next words would likely determine not just the resolution of this immediate conflict, but the future relationships and power dynamics within the royal family. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the monarch wrestled with loyalties that pulled him in multiple directions: his love for his deceased first wife, his commitment to his current marriage, and his responsibilities to his children and the institution of the monarchy itself. King James moved slowly to his desk, his measured steps echoing in the tense silence of the blue drawing room. Catherine watched as he opened a drawer and withdrew a leather-bound folder that she recognized as the type used for important royal documents and correspondence. "Before we proceed," the king said, his voice carrying the formal authority that had commanded respect for over 2 decades of reign, "I think it would be helpful for everyone to understand exactly what Isabella's written wishes specified regarding her private chambers." Margaret's confident posture faltered slightly as she realized that her husband was about to reference the very document that William had mentioned earlier. Catherine could see the queen consort calculating rapidly, trying to determine how much the king had known about her activities and how much he had chosen to overlook. King James opened the folder and removed a sheet of elegant stationery that bore Queen Isabella's distinctive handwriting. The sight of his first wife's familiar script seemed to affect the monarch deeply, and he paused for a moment before continuing. "Isabella wrote this letter during her final weeks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was very specific about her wishes for several personal matters, including the disposition of her private chambers." He began to read from the document, and Queen Isabella's voice seemed to fill the room through her husband's measured recitation. "My dearest James, as I prepare for whatever time remains to me, I want to ensure that certain personal wishes are clearly understood. My private chambers in the East Wing have been my sanctuary for over 40 years of marriage and monarchy. These rooms hold not just my belongings, but the memories of countless private moments, letters from our children, quiet conversations, peaceful hours of reading and reflection. I request that these chambers remain unchanged for at least 5 years following my death, serving as a place where family members can feel close to my memory and perhaps find comfort in familiar surroundings during their grieving process. The king paused, looking up at his assembled family. She went on to specify that any future decisions about these rooms should be made collectively by the family, with particular consideration for William's wishes as the heir and the son who was closest to his mother. Catherine felt the weight of these words settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Queen Isabella had clearly anticipated the potential for conflict over her personal spaces and had tried to prevent exactly the kind of violation that had occurred. Margaret's face had grown pale as the full implications of the letter became clear. Not only had she violated the late Queen's explicit wishes, but she had done so in a way that directly contradicted the collaborative decision-making process that Isabella had specifically requested. William stepped forward, his composure carefully maintained, but his voice carrying unmistakable pain. "Father, when you shared Mother's other wishes with the family after her funeral, why wasn't this particular request discussed?" King James closed his eyes briefly, and Catherine realized that the monarch was grappling with his own role in the current crisis. "I shared most of Isabella's written wishes immediately," the king admitted. "But this particular request about her chambers seems so obvious, so clearly aligned with our natural impulse to preserve her memory, that I didn't think formal discussion was necessary. I assumed that all family members would naturally respect such an important space." The admission hung in the air, revealing the gap between assumption and reality that had allowed Margaret's violations to occur unchecked. Margaret finally found her voice, though her usual confidence had been replaced by defensive uncertainty. "James, you never specifically told me about Isabella's written wishes regarding her chambers. If I had known about her formal request, I would never have made the decision to use those rooms. But you did know." Catherine found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to enter the conversation. "You knew that the family had collectively agreed to preserve those chambers. You knew that they held special significance for William and Alexander. You knew that using them without permission would be seen as a violation of trust." Margaret turned to face Catherine with flashing eyes. "I don't recall asking for your opinion on family matters that preceded your arrival here." "Catherine has every right to speak," William said firmly. She discovered this situation, and her perspective as someone who genuinely respected our mother's memory is entirely relevant. King James raised his hand again, seeking to prevent the confrontation from escalating further. "Margaret, I need to understand how you made the decision to use Isabella's chambers. Walk me through your reasoning." Margaret looked at her husband for a long moment, clearly calculating how much honesty she could afford in this moment of crisis. The rooms were beautiful and unused. She began carefully. "I thought occasionally staying there would help me understand Isabella better, perhaps bring us closer even after her death. I never intended disrespect." "You replaced her bedding," Alexander said quietly, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had moved to the drawing room. "You moved your personal belongings into her private spaces. Mother Margaret, how does that demonstrate respect or a desire for connection?" The pain in Alexander's voice was evident, and Catherine realized that perhaps the most profound damage from this situation was the erosion of trust between Alexander and the woman who had helped raise him following his mother's death. Margaret's carefully constructed explanations were crumbling under the weight of specific evidence and the emotional testimony of the people she had hurt. "I made mistakes," she admitted finally. "Perhaps I was too practical in my approach, too focused on not wanting beautiful spaces to remain empty. But my intentions were never malicious." "Intentions matter," King James said slowly, "but actions matter more. The fact remains that you systematically violated your late wife's written wishes, deceived your family about your activities, and caused pain to people who trusted you." The formal tone in the king's voice suggested that he was transitioning from husband and stepfather to monarch, preparing to render judgment on a situation that had implications beyond personal relationships. The question now, he continued, is how to address this situation in a way that honors Isabella's memory, respects the pain that has been caused, and preserves the unity that our family and our institution require. William stepped forward, his bearing indicating that he had specific proposals for resolution. Father, I believe the solution must address both the immediate violation and the need to prevent similar situations in the future. Queen Isabella's chambers must be immediately restored to their original condition, with all of her personal belongings returned exactly as they were. Additionally, I think we need a formal written protocol regarding the preservation of royal memory spaces so that future decisions are made transparently and collectively. Margaret opened her mouth to object, but King James forestalled her with a gentle but firm gesture. William's suggestions are reasonable and necessary, the king said. Margaret, you will immediately cease using Isabella's chambers and ensure that all of your personal belongings are removed. Mrs. Pemberton will oversee the restoration of the rooms to their exact previous condition. Furthermore, he continued, his voice growing stronger, I want a written apology from you to William and Alexander, acknowledging the pain this situation has caused and committing to greater transparency in future decisions that affect family memory and tradition. Catherine watched Margaret struggle with the king's pronouncement. The public nature of the required apology would be particularly difficult for a woman who had built her identity around maintaining dignity and control. James, Margaret said carefully, surely such formal measures are unnecessary within a family. Can't we resolve this through private conversation and mutual understanding? Mother Margaret, Alexander said, his voice heavy with disappointment, this breach of trust requires more than private conversation. William and I need concrete assurance that our mother's memory will be protected and that future decisions will be made honestly. The finality in Alexander's tone seemed to convince Margaret that resistance would only worsen her position. She nodded slowly, the gesture reflecting both acceptance and defeat. Very well, she said. I will do as you've requested, and I will ensure that nothing like this happens again. King James looked around the room, taking in the faces of his family members and the complex emotions that played across their features. I hope, he said quietly, that we can all learn from this situation and emerge stronger as a family. Isabella valued honesty, respect, and consideration for others above all else. Honoring her memory means embodying those values in our daily lives and our relationships with each other. As the family began to disperse, Catherine felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Justice had been served, and Queen Isabella's memory would be properly protected. But the cost in terms of family relationships and trust would take much longer to heal. William approached Catherine as they left the drawing room. Thank you, he said simply. Mother would have appreciated having someone willing to defend her memory, even at personal cost. Catherine nodded, understanding that while this particular crisis had been resolved, the deeper work of rebuilding family trust and unity was just beginning, but she also felt confident that Queen Isabella's legacy of dignity and respect would continue to guide them through the challenges ahead. The late Queen's chambers would be restored, her memory preserved, and her family would eventually heal. Sometimes, Catherine reflected, the most important battles were fought not for power or position, but for the simple principle that love and respect should extend beyond death, protecting what cannot protect itself.